Well, hello folks. Today we're into chapter 26 of Matthew's Gospel, one of the longest chapters in the Bible. It's 75 verses, and so much happens here as well. Jesus is quickly approaching the end of his earthly ministry, his earthly life, and really he's about to complete the task his Father had sent him to do. His whole life and ministry had been marked out by obedience to his Father's will, and these final few days were no exception. And this chapter contains so many significant and kind of iconic moments from the life of Jesus. His anointing at Bethany with the perfume over his head, Judas's betrayal, the Last Supper, the prayers at Gethsemane, his arrest, his trial, the cruel moment of Peter's denial. And sadly, we just don't have time to look at all this in any kind of detail, but I wanted to mention just one or two things. Firstly, the Passover meal was the perfect feast for Jesus' Last Supper. Of course, at the Last Supper, Jesus created a template that believers still use today in communion services all around the world. The breaking of bread and the drinking of wine in remembrance of his body broken and his blood poured out for us. And interestingly, the commentator Michael Green mentions how the Passover feast had three particular dimensions to it. It looked back to the past, the deliverance of the Israelites from bondage in Egypt. It focused on the present, gave strength, nourishment for the journey ahead. And it looked forward to the future towards that promised land of God. And Green points out that Jesus' Last Supper also kind of carries on these same strands of thinking as we remember him then in communion. So it looks back to the past when Jesus delivered us from sin and bondage on the cross. It would give strength to our bodies and our souls for the difficult journey of Christian life in the present, in the here and now. And it would be a foretaste of future glory, the great wedding banquet in heaven. So this was a special, poignant moment, his last meal with the disciples, his brothers who had followed him and shared with him in his ministry as much as they could. Perhaps a calm moment before the storm that lay ahead. But sadly, as it always does, the sinfulness of man ruins the scene. Jesus announces that someone is going to betray him. And one by one, they declare, "Surely not I." If you were there, would you not say the same? "Surely not I. I would never betray you, Lord, not me. I am faithful to you." And I'm sure all of the disciples, maybe bar one, meant it. But within a few hours, Judas would betray him for money. Peter would deny even knowing him, and the rest would flee the scene to save their own skin. You see, as Jesus approaches the cross, he will be betrayed, abandoned, and rejected, even by his closest allies and dearest friends. But I wonder, does this not signify something deeply profound? Two things, in fact. It contrasts the ugliness and cruelty of human sin against the spotless humility and righteousness of Jesus. And even more significantly then, secondly, it shows us that Jesus must do this final part of his mission alone, entirely alone, since he is the only one who can. He is the only one worthy to die for the sins of the world. Only he can drink from the cup of God's wrath and survive. Only he can atone for our sin. Only he is truly innocent and free of all the accusations thrown in the trial. Only he can go to the cross of salvation. Another thing we notice in Gethsemane is yet again the importance that Jesus places on prayer. Really, before he does anything, before he says anything, we get the impression in the gospel accounts that Jesus first prays. He goes to his Father, he aligns his will with his, he seeks power and strength from above. And the same is clear here. And we learn some valuable lessons from Gethsemane. So even when Jesus is facing certain death, he's on his knees in prayer. And that should be our first response in times of crisis and despair. Secondly, then, he urges his brothers to pray with him. There is significance in shared prayer. There is a place for believers praying together, seeking the Lord together. Thirdly, he prays 3 times for the exact same thing. So repeated prayer is acceptable before God, not endless, needless words. Rather, it's genuine cries of the heart going out to the Lord, eagerly searching an answer. And finally, as tough as this one is to hear, it shows us that sometimes prayers are not answered as we desire. Jesus is desperate not to be forsaken by his Father. Such is his love for him. He's desperate not to feel the weight of the full wrath of God. But this is the plan. This has always been the plan. This is the Father's will. And so Jesus' prayer gets a negative answer. He must go to the cross. And sometimes, folks, our prayers receive that negative answer as well. Perhaps we might get angry or we ask why. Either way, our number one priority ought to match Jesus's, and that is being obedient to our Father's will. He is God. He has the perfect plan. He is good and faithful. And so we must and we can trust in him. Finally, then, I just want to point out one key moment from Jesus' trial. He stands before Caiaphas, the high priest, and in what seems like the most absurdly unjust trial in history, they stand around trying to kind of chuck any accusation possible at Jesus, waiting for one to stick, hoping that someone will come up with something so they can put him to death within the bounds of Jewish law. And in the end, Caiaphas just asks him directly, are you the Messiah, the Son of God? And this is the key question in the whole of the gospel. Really, this is the most important question in the history of the world. And this is the question that every single person on earth must decide for themselves. Is Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God, or is he not? If he is, then everything changes. It changes how we live our lives, and it changes how we view our world. If he's not, then the Bible all comes toppling down. This whole thing is a waste of time, and Christianity should be discarded as utter nonsense. So what is Jesus' answer? Well, he says, you have said so. So Jesus is saying that's you putting it your way. But really, you see, Jesus had never courted the titles of Son of God or Messiah. He hadn't denied them, but he hadn't craved them either. Rather, he had identified himself in different kind of terms. So this is how he explains it then to Caiaphas in the very next verse. He says, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. And this is quite a response he's made here. You see, Jesus saw himself as the Son of Man from Daniel chapter 7, the one to whom all kingdoms would eventually bow down and whose dominion would be everlasting and indestructible. And Daniel 7 also talks about the Son of Man ascending to the Ancient of Days, to God himself. And isn't that precisely what Jesus was about to do? One commentator says the criminal's cross would prove to be the prince's throne. So make no doubt about it here. Jesus stands, despite being on trial, being whipped, mocked, beaten, and spit upon. He is boldly claiming that the future assigned to the Son of Man, or to the Messiah, however we want to put it, shall soon be his. And this interaction with Caiaphas seals his destiny. This was enough of a confession to sentence him to death. But the amazing part is, these chief priests and teachers of the law, they were convinced that they were getting rid of this man once and for all. Incredibly, though, this was all part of God's master plan of salvation since before the creation of the world. And in actual fact, these people were fulfilling those very plans. Amazing stuff from a heart-wrenching and brutal chapter of the Bible. That's us for now, folks. Join us on Monday as we start to bring our time in Matthew to a close. Until then, stay safe, and as ever, God bless.